All right, Wendy Becker dancing to the Four Tops just is like a perfect beginning to my my day. And yes, my day begins at noon. Okay, so let's get into it. Let's just say a blessing to bring some holiness into our learning today. Blessing over the study of Torah, one of our sacred practices. Baruch atah Adonai Eloheinu melech haolam asher kidshanu b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu la'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, so I'm very excited to explore the material with you today. We're going to look at a question that I've always been like a little bit like fascinated, troubled, perplexed by this question, and it's a question. It's what I would call a parshanut question, meaning what's going on here in the text? How do we make sense of what's happening in the text? But the question that we ask will inevitably kick up all kinds of gendered just issues around gender that obviously are important in our contemporary Jewish conversation. Okay, but we tend to have those conversations around gender and especially gendered singing through the prism of Jewish law, interpretation of strict fidelity to, rejection of whatever. Like, we're not going to have that conversation today, though we'll implicate that conversation, so we'll keep it in mind. But we're going to explore the narrative, the story of the Torah itself, and try and understand through a series of commentaries what exactly might be going on here. But let's just start with our own interpretations. So this week, Parshat Bashalach, we call Shabbat Shirah, the Sabbath of song. It's known as Shabbat Shirah because of the central, the sort of climax, magnificent climax in this week's Parsha, which is the song of the sea, the song at the sea. And many of you know this song. We say it every day in our morning prayers, Az Yashir Moshe, right? So let's just start there. There's this song that was sung. I won't yet name an actor, but the song was sung at the sea, at the parting of the Red Sea, in response to the greatest miracle our people have ever known, the splitting of the Red Sea. Okay, pretty famous, setting there, backdrop there. So let me just start by asking you, either just by your memory of the text or what you presume, who sang that song? Who sang the song at the sea? Can someone just give me an answer? I see. Okay, Noah's going to help me out. No, I can't hear you.
From memory, presumably Miriam, the women, and the children, though I'm sure.
You're cheating. You're not giving me the real answer. You already know where I'm going, so you're giving me the answer that we will get to. But who sang the song at the sea?
Moses and the children of Israel. Moses.
Susan.
Moses and the children of Israel.
The children of Israel. Now, first of all, Az yashir Moshe uvenei Yisrael et hashira azot ladonai vayomru lemor. Moses and the children of Israel sang. Now, okay, so Moses sang the song. And the children of Israel, that's everybody. I guess they all sang the song. It's a little complicated. Even saying that is a little complicated because the verb tenses are like they move from the singular to the plural. So let's just start there. Oh wait, hold on. I was learning some advanced techniques in screen sharing from Andrea before the class, and now I'm confused where I am. Okay, here we are. Okay, so here's how it begins. Az Yashir Moshe, this verb right here is a singular verb. So it's then Moses sang. And actually it's more complicated than that because it's in the future tense, but that's not important for us right now. So then Moses sang, and the children of Israel, and then this is in the plural, and they said, right? You can see that reflected in the English here. So, okay, so it seems like there was some singing that Moses, I don't know, maybe started, or whatever. Let's not get too nitpicky here. It was Moses and everybody else. Moses led them and the whole nation sang, right? And then we've got this long song, which, you know, in our biblical poetry class, actually, we spent an entire hour just sort of moving through, trying to understand lots of complicated Latin. The God is a man of war, descriptions of the flood stood straight like a wall, and then some just like beautiful, who is like you, eternal one, among the celestials? In your love, you lead the people you redeemed. In your strength, beautiful, beautiful, wonderful, wonderful. And then all of a sudden, so the song ends, and this is, no one knew where we were going. This is where we're going. And this is our question for today. The song ends, for the horses of Pharaoh with his chariots and horsemen went into the sea, and the Eternal turned back on them the waters of the sea, but the Israelites marched on dry ground in the midst of the sea. And then, this is what we're going to try and understand. Then Miriam, the prophetess, V'tikach Miriam haniviyah, achot Aaron, Aaron's sister, took a timbrel in her hand, and all the women went out after her in dance with timbrels. Okay, that's quite beautiful, but it's not difficult. It's like, oh, okay, I guess the song was sung, and then Miriam and all the women went out and played music. We could spend time asking, why did they do that? Why the women? You know, there's a lot to ask even in this verse, but what I find particularly fascinating and difficult is the next line. And Miriam answered to them, sing to the Eternal, who has triumphed gloriously, hurling horse and driver into the sea. Sing to the Eternal, who has triumphed gloriously, hurling horse and driver into the sea. Shiru ladonai. This is so annoying. Shiru ladonai. Ki ga'o ga'a sus v'rocho rama vayam. And that, of course, is the first line of the Song of the Sea. Right? Sing to the Eternal, who has triumphed glory, hurling horse and driver into the sea. So, this is the question. What did Miriam sing? Or maybe that's too much. Who was it singing there? Who was singing what? That's the question. Moses and the children of Israel sang this big song, and then all of a sudden, Miriam and the women go out, and Miriam, it says, said to them, who are they? The first line of the song. So, and then, by the way, just to make the difficulty clear, and then we move on. Then Moses caused Israel to set out from the Sea of Reeds. Like, after this verse, they start traveling, literally. So let's just start there. What did Miriam and the women do? And what did they sing? How do we make sense of the whole song and then the first verse of the song? Does anyone just on the shot reading there, the simple reading, have a read of this? Florine, nice to see you. Yeah, Florine from our biblical poetry class.
Thank you. Well, for me, it's a poetic echo again. It's an echo of the first verse. And it's like, it puts it in context. That part is ended, and now we move. It's like
okay.
It's a poetic echo used as a stop.
Okay. If I understand you correctly, Florine, then it's like we are not to take the features of this choreography too seriously, too exactingly. The idea is, yes, indeed, they sang, and you could look over and see Miriam sing. It was just sort of like this. And they all sang, didn't they? The end, and then we move on. That's fair. That's fair. It's a poetic echo, as Florine puts it. Joni, what do you think?
I think that identifying her as Aaron's sister is very important in terms of future alliances. And I think also the redundancy, there's something about leadership, and there's something about also identifying her as a prophetess.
Yeah.
And it's as if she's impelled to step forth, and it's almost like the beginning of Rosh Chodesh. I mean, there's some kind of sense of something is looming. There's something about her leadership, her voice, that not only came within her, but she's being called, and she's being identified as a prophetess.
Great, that's very helpful, Joni. That is all true. There's some very specific and new language here. This is the first time Miriam has been called a prophet, or prophetess, as they say, but prophet. And yeah, take a look. As Joni notices, Miriam's a prophetess, and she was Aaron's sister. And like, this began with Moses, and this echo, as Florian puts it, begins with Miriam, but it's Miriam in the same family, and she's a prophet too, and she's the sister of Aaron. And in other words, Joni says there's some kind of, what's important in this moment is that the leaders of the community rise and lead the community into this glorious celebration. And of course, Moses is going to do that. And I don't know why Aaron doesn't, but he's mentioned along there. Maybe that just amplifies the sentiment. But Miriam also, it's important in this moment. What is important is that Miriam displays her leadership. And as we say that, then we also have to begin to wonder about how that leadership played out with respect to gender. Because it seems like, just the simple reading, it seems like Miriam was the leader of something that was happening among the women. So is that what's going on here? Is Moses led the men in song and Miriam led the women in song because Moses was the leader of the men and Miriam was the leader of the women? If that's so, that's not something that gets discussed a lot in the tradition, but this moment seems to suggest it. So let's keep interpreting. Wendy?
Rabbi Kasher, sorry, I'm gonna real quick jump in and ask, there's some requests for the source sheet in the chat.
Oh, sorry, yeah, sorry, I just forgot to do that. Here you go. Wendy.
I think just on the pshat level, whenever we see things repeated in Torah, it's a reminder, this is something to really pay attention to. And you're talking about these exact words that Moses sang, and then Miriam says the exact same words. And then to take that even in another context, we talk about song. I think this is possibly the first time song per se is mentioned in Torah. And when you sing something, there's much more. To sing something takes much more intention, much more time, and certainly sticks a lot stronger than mere words. That things were sung, that this moment, this feeling was so profoundly important that everyone had to stop and really pay attention and sing about this glorious occurrence, and that everybody was affected by this.
Great. That is beautiful and profound. And I think I also hear in your description a particular arrangement. That's part of what I want to try and figure out is like what actually happened, and then think about the implications. And what actually happened in your description sounds like Miriam heard the song. Moses started to sing a song, and Miriam kind of picked up on it and said, I will sing the same song. You know, Az Yashir Moshe, right? Ki ga'o ga'a, and Miriam hears that and says, yeah, ki ga'o ga'a, and then all of a sudden everybody's kind of singing, everybody joins in the song. And part of what this is, Miriam was the one who led everybody to join in the song, might be one way of thinking of it, right?
I think it's also possible, it's not just a song, it's a chant. And chanting is a very important part of spiritual practice. And we're seeing that even as in the beginning, Moses sang and the people sang. Miriam sang and or played and the women played. It's this what's the word? You know, back and forth. So that, and it's a constant, and that's that particular form of song is very powerful in spiritual terms too.
Okay, so that's helpful too. What Wendy notes here is this language that Miriam the prophetess answered, the ta'an lam. Actually, the truth is it's sometimes translated as Miriam chanted to them. Exactly what Wendy said. And the reason is this is like Moses sang, right? But she responded or answered, and that suggests that there was a call and response.
Pontiffin,
Yeah, like Moses sings a line, maybe Moses and the men sing a line, and then Miriam and the women sing a line, and that's like, just like we do in our own prayers, right? Ho du ladonai ki tov, ho du ladonai ki tov. There's a kind of an echo, and that's the way that the song is supposed to be sung. And Miriam knows that Miriam and Moses are tuned into one another, and so they lead this back and forth. And you can actually, what I think Wendy suggests here is you can actually imagine that the song at the sea was like, every line was like A, B, B, C, C, all the way down. And there was this sort of back and forth chorus, again, between the men and the women, presumably, right? Although, I don't know, maybe Miriam just leads everybody in the back and forth. Okay. All right. Let's take a couple of more answers, and then I want to dive into the commentators who have their own theories about this. I see Max Silberstein is eager to talk. No.
Just because it's a very little thing. The Song of the Sea is structurally different in the Sefer Torah. It's written differently, set out as poetry. Is this piece set out differently?
Good question. My gut answer is no. This is not, but let's just look it up. Anyone know offhand?
Got to affect the meaning. I don't know how. I don't have the next step of and therefore, but it's something different. It's either structurally like the first or it's structurally not.
Yeah.
And that
Randy's looking it up for us. Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, the Song at the Sea is really distinct. In our poetry class, we talk about this sometimes. There is plenty of poetry or poetic language in the Bible, but most of it is not noted as poetry by the scribal tradition. You just have to hear the language. But the Song of the Sea is written in a certain way. It's written to look like the sea parting. It has a very specific and beautiful layout. So that gives that whole song its own sort of special status. And I think it is a good question. Does Miriam's song also get kind of written out in that way?
It looks like it does, at least in the Tanakh that I have in front of me.
Okay. We're seeing, look at Randy Weiss here. Like, how do you do this? Pin, spotlight for everybody. Yeah. Okay. There's, I don't know, Ed. It
wasn't. And so
that doesn't look like it is.
Okay.
Me, right? Now how do I unspotlight this? Unspotlight. How do I unspotlight, Andrea? Or we're just gonna see Randy forever?
No, it's unspotlighted. It should be back to you now.
Okay, fine. Okay, fine. So there we are. We're like dealing with this this famous song, and then we've got just kind of like a mysterious echo of those very same words. I mean, that's what's part of what's strange about this, is it doesn't just say, and Miriam also sang. That, I don't know, like we would have assumed she joined along, but she says the very same words, but only the first line. Okay, so let's just start with the commentators who are going to offer us different kind of choreographies here. And I think each of the suggestions maps out for us a very different picture of what was happening there. And I'm interested in the picture of what was happening there, both, as I said at the outset, both just as a matter of understanding this ceremony, but also I can't help but also be interested in what is this saying about gender and the way that that gender roles played out in this sort of imagination of this moment of ancient Israel. So here's one imagination. Here's one version of it. The version maybe the most well known because it's the one that Rashi gives. And what Rashi said. So first of all, what Rashi says is. Moshe Amar Shira, Moses sang the song, La'anashim, to the men. Hu Omer vehem onin macharav. He sang it and they repeated after him. So this is a little bit like Wendy's version, but it's just happening with the men. Miriam Amra Shira La'anashim, and she did the same to the women. She sang the song to the women. And it doesn't say, and they answered, but I think the implication is, and they answered. Okay? So the one line that we get from Miriam is just a shorthand for she did the same thing. Moses sang this call and response song, and so did Miriam. But Moses did it to the men, and Miriam did it to the women. And the Bechor Shor, another medieval commentator, he just says it more explicitly, right? They sing to the Eternal. The women, they sang the whole song. But since it was all written above, only one verse is written here. Okay, so that's the answer to the why only one line, is that this is just a shorthand, but this is to tell you that Miriam did the same thing. Okay, so that's how Rashi imagines this scene, is that the men are over here and Moses is like, Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed, and all the men are like, Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed. And meanwhile, simultaneously, I'm not sure exactly how Rashi is reading, but Miriam's doing the same thing to the women, Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed, and all the women are saying Adonai yimloch le'olam va'ed, right? Does that seem like the reading there? And if that is so, I guess I want to ask with all of these interpretations, why? What does that mean? If the Torah if Rashi's right, and we'll soon consider, a different interpretation, maybe he's wrong, but if Rashi's right, that all the men were singing the song over here led by Moses, and all the women were singing the song over here led by Miriam. I don't know, what do you make of that? Why? Why would they sing it separated by gender? Is it like, what's going on there? Let me bring Esra in.
Oh, well, I don't have an answer to that, but I do find this topic very interesting. I just had a question, which is, do we have any other examples of Torah specifically kind of highlighting or selecting out or pointing out a woman's voice in song prior to this?
None. The quick answer is not prior to this, but there is a significant example afterwards, and that is Devorah. Devorah, who was also notably the actual leader of Israel, right? A woman who led the people, also famously sang a song.
Okay. Oh, and then I think Noah did mention that in the chat. Okay. Well, anyhow, that was just, I just keep coming back to why Miriam, why now?
Yeah. So, as you mentioned these examples of women singing, right? I think at this point, I want to at least raise the kind of inevitable associations that can be made in the Jewish conversation when we start saying things like women singing. Because here Miriam is singing and Devorah sings, and these women sing in very public and powerful ways. And yet we have this later tradition that develops in Jewish law, and probably many of you are familiar with it, that a woman's singing voice shouldn't be heard by men. And that comes from a statement in the Talmud, which I'm going to show it to you. And we're not going to do a lot of the, legal reckoning here, like what does that mean? But I want to share it with you because inevitably, any of the later commentaries who are looking at a scene like this are going to be thinking, like, what do we do with the fact that Miriam so boldly sang, or Devorah did, when we know that, from the Talmud that women shouldn't be singing publicly? How do we make sense of that? So let's just so we have it in the mix here, I just want you to see this statement from the Talmud. Shmuel said, a woman's voice is nakedness. Kol be'isha erva, and nakedness is the thing that you're not supposed to uncover, right? In all the sexual laws in the Torah. So what is it? What are you not supposed to uncover, right? Like there's a discussion in the Talmud, and it includes, obvious, more private areas that you would think of, but also, strangely, kol be'isha, her voice is nakedness. What does that mean? And the proof text is from Song of Songs, sweet is your voice and your countenance is alluring. Now, it's kind of a clever proof text because it both seems to suggest that voice is a turn on, but also it has the word arev, which means sweet, but is similar to the word erva, nakedness. Okay, so there's classic rabbinic interpretation, but in this case, an interpretation that causes tremendous frustration for many of us living in a post-feminist era, where the implication is that women should never sing in public, right? If at all, okay? So that's out there, and I didn't bring, but you'll deal with a lot of commentaries who are just trying to actually just figure this out. How did Miriam sing? She's not supposed to sing. But we're not going to go down that road today, because the Torah comes first. We want to take the position of the Torah seriously, and yet, even in the Torah, we seem to see some kind of gender separation. So what is it? Why do the women do something differently than the men do? And what does that mean? So let's continue to consider. Payam.
I have a different take on this. If you look at the first one, there's something distinctly different between when Moses sang and when Miriam. The first part, it says to the eternal, and the second part lacks that. And if you look at the Torah itself, that's in poetry, the first song. So it's a different type of singing. I mean, to the eternal could be almost like davening. It could be silent, and then the women took that and vocalized it. So it could be two distinctly different types of singing.
Interesting. Well, now, Miriam does say sing to the eternal, though.
If you look at the beginning of Moses, they sang to the eternal. If you go to the
right. Interesting.
Because when it's with Miriam, it's part of the song.
Yeah.
In the Hebrew.
Interesting, right. Moses sang the song to the eternal. Miriam encourages them to sing to the eternal. So that is interesting. Payam suggests that maybe it's Moses after all. Man or woman, whatever else he is, Moses is the greatest prophet. So maybe Moses is in, as he always is, in dialogue with God. And Miriam, his sister, who herself a prophet, comes along and says, okay, let's everybody do that. Let's try to connect this song to the eternal. But it's more of let's take that cue and focus our attention that way, rather than Moses, who is literally in dialogue with the eternal. Right? Interesting. Joel, what do you think?
I just wanted to get back to the commentary by Bechor Shor, Sing to the Eternal. They sang the whole song, but since it was all written above, only one verse is written when they come to Miriam, right? But the Torah in certain locations doesn't shy away from repeating verbatim various things. So for instance, when the Mishkan is going to be dedicated, the princes, each of which heads one of the 12 tribes, they bring an offering, each of them. And it's exactly the same. And the Torah has exactly the same items that they bring, and the weights and the quantity and all that. So when the Torah wants to, it can, it can quote verbatim and spell out exactly. Whereas, Bechor Shor says, well, Miriam, since it was it was the song, it was the same song, we're only going to give you the first part of it, and we can just imagine that she's saying the whole. So I don't know if that's what's going on or not.
Excellent. Okay, that is excellent. That's really a really sharp parshanut question, because Joel's exactly right. to assume that the song, as Rashi seems to, as the Bechor Shor does, is just shorthand, meaning that the first line is just to tell you, yeah, Miriam did that too, but she did it with the women. But it was the same song. We're not going to write the whole thing again. But Joel says, what are you talking about? Not write the whole thing again. Have you ever read Parshat Vayakel? The whole Parsha is a repetition of Parshat Truma. There's all kinds of in Chayei Sarah, when the servant retells the entire story of his journey. There's all kinds of repetition. We're sometimes frustrated with the excessive repetition, word for word. And Joel gives another example, the offerings, which are exactly the same, but repeated 12 times. So how do we say that this is shorthand? Maybe, and now I'm adding to what Joel said, maybe what Miriam sang was just the first verse. Okay, and if that is so, what does that mean? Now, just to add some kind of strength to this position, I want to give you another commentator who assumes just that. He assumes that Miriam only sang the first verse, and then he comes up with the wildest explanation of why. I'm just going to share it with you because it's just a fantastic and kind of curious way of resolving the problem. I'm not very convinced by it, and it does fall into the category of a classic apologetic for the distinction between men and women in Jewish tradition, which is that women do less because they're holier. Okay, have you heard that? Women are obligated less because they're actually on a higher spiritual level. Listen to this formulation of it, though. This is a particularly intricate formulation of it. But what's important for us is that he assumes that only the first verse was sung. Okay, so let's just for the sake of our own learning, let's take a look at the Khatam Sofer. Khatam Sofer, Hungarian, very like sort of the beginning of ultra orthodoxy, very like intense, like fundamentalist kind of thinker. And he asked the question, one must ask, why did Miriam sing this song only about the suffering of the Egyptians? She only sang hurling a horse and driver into the sea. It's a good point. The thing that she sang isn't even the best part of the song. The first line's not great. It's all about the destruction. Why didn't she sing about the salvation of Israel like Moses and the children of Israel did? In your love, you lead the people you redeem. That's a great line. So Miriam, he assumes, just sang the first verse. Okay, now I'm going to give you his answer, which I don't want us to spend a lot of time on, but it is interesting. And we may answer, it is known that something is called a miracle when the Holy Blessed One pushes aside nature and the workings of the heavens. When God stops the natural order, that's a miracle. And it is also known, another kind of fact for him, is that nature is subservient to Torah. Nature bends its will to spirituality, to godliness. If that is so, he says, then the more righteous a person is, the more likely it is that nature will be changed for their needs and their well-being. Okay, another kind of incredible theological thing to say. So the miracle itself becomes smaller for them because nature is already inclined in this way. And the less righteous a person is, the grander the miracle seems for them. Okay, this is like just a strange thing to say. If you're a bad person and a miracle happens to you, wow, that's amazing. If you were already a good person, it's kind of like it's bound to happen. And we know from the Talmud, this is a statement of the Talmud, that here it was in the merit of righteous women that they were redeemed. That's one of the legends in the Talmud, that it was the women, it was in the merit of the women who, after all, put Moses in the basket, saved Moses from, there's lots of reason to say this. Therefore, for the women, the salvation and redemption were smaller than a miracle because nature was already inclined to help them. Okay, so that's quite a like twisted, tangled explanation. But leaving the theology aside, I want us to consider his assumption in the text, which is that Miriam only sang the first line. And what would that mean? What would it mean if Moses and the children of Israel sang one song and then Miriam went out with all the women and they just sang the first line? What would that, this is my tambourine. What would that mean, right? Okay, so I'm putting that question out there as well. Lila?
I don't know what it would mean. it be an interesting model for like, you know, maybe prayer and song has evolved in such a way that today we have, you know, sometimes we take one line, liturgy or whatever it is, and we sing it over and over again. So like that could be interesting. But I think we're asking this question of like, why is it split along these gender, you know, lines? And it may be really simple that this was like a common practice of the time, you know, that it wasn't abnormal to see this with like the group of women here and a group of men here and different. And in fact, I think it would back up this Kol Isha, you know, voice, not hearing the voice of women thing potentially. But I also think that like the slavery and Exodus story like sets us up for, this is a kind of follow up to what's been going on. Like the story is not really like a uniform story for all of the Israelites as slaves. It is a kind of gendered story. They're having different experiences. Like it's the male boys, you know, that are supposed to be killed, and it's the mothers that are, you know, and it's, I mean, you have the midwives, and you have, you know, you do have all these female characters as the, what is it, Khatam Sofer?
Yeah.
Yeah. So yeah, and then I think maybe the men are out in the fields, and you know, maybe the women are not slaves in this way.
Yeah.
So it's just, it might follow what the story's already set up for us, which is like the men and women having very different experiences.
Yeah, those are all really, I think, helpful and interesting speculations. That is, well, let me just take the first part of what Lila said, because Lila did actually answer the question or the scene that the Khatam Sofer puts in front of us, which is that she suggests that it's just like we do, which is, you know, what do we sing at Ikar all the time? Ozi v'zimrat yavahili lishua, Ozi v'zimrat yavahili lishua, right? Again and again and again and again and again and again. That's a line from the Song of the Sea. So we just sing that one line. We like that line, right? So Miriam she just heard the song and she's like, okay, let's turn the first verse into a real song. Moses sang this big chanted thing. It's very nice, but nobody can remember all that. And Miriam comes in and says, okay, horse and drivers hurled, the Khatam Sofer is right. Maybe she didn't pick the best line, but whatever. She took a line and repeated it, and that's the way our liturgical tradition develops. And one of the ways of looking at this is like, yeah, Moses is the prophet, and Moses is like singing the first prophetic song, but Miriam knows how to turn it into music because Miriam brings out the instruments, turns it into a dance, takes that song, that first line, repeats it. So that I think that's a very interesting way to think of what the Torah is doing here, which is the Torah is introducing the beginning of the liturgical tradition, right? And Miriam is sort of the composer here. I love that. Okay, but Lila says something else that is important for us to consider, which is we must, after all, take into account the gendered nature of this description. Miriam and the women went out. And Miriam sang to them, presumably to the women. Rashi assumed that as well. And so we do potentially have the women organized in one way, doing one thing, celebrating in their own style, with their own choreography, and the men doing their thing. And Lila says, yeah, that's, first of all, ancient society was gendered and often separated. And in particular, this story was very gendered. And men may not, like, Lila's not buying into the Khatam Sofers, necessarily into the Khatam Sofer, like the women were less impressed by the miracle because they were already holier, but she is saying they did have a different experience. So maybe it makes sense to say that the women sang a particular song, right? The Khatam Sofer, by the way, I left out, he goes into a long explanation of why the women focused on the destruction, right? And the men like included these other things, and he imagines that the women had a particular encounter with their aggressors, and we can obviously imagine what that might be, right? Women being assaulted in a different way than men were, and so maybe there is a fundamentally different experience happening here, and so a different response. Okay, so I love all that. Let's see, David Kurtz, where are you? David Kurtz? What, is that just a screen background, or are you?
I'm in the BVIs. I did a COVID jump.
Oh my gosh.
Just escaped. I just had it. Yeah, very lucky. You know, kind of taking off on what Lila was saying, Moses has an interesting relationship with women in a way. Well, let's put it this way. He's very involved in, you know, following what God wants him to do at this point. He's nation building. That's very important to him. He's trying to keep all these people together. And Miriam feels like she's got her eye on the ball with what's left in Genesis, which is the family and family building. And, you know, it could be like, hey, we're over here. I think of Moses with the Jethro story coming up, you know, where Jethro shows up with his family and Moses basically blows him off. He doesn't have any interest, any time for it. And I think Miriam may be setting up the paradigm as keeping our eye on that kind of ball too.
It's interesting. That's interesting. In other words, in a way, this is, I hesitate to use the word a feminist a moment, but a moment of women reminding men that, hey, we're here too, and we have to, like, there's some kind of not so fast in what Miriam is doing that might be worth us considering, both in asserting her own leadership, but also in saying, like, hey, this is my constituency, half of the nation. So let's take note of that as well. That's an interesting.
Yeah, and she's sexy and she's dancing. It's timbrels. You know, it's kind of like, hey, slaves. You know, like, let's change our mentality. It has a feeling of
interesting too.
Freedom.
That's interesting too. S.J. Sachs.
Okay.
There you are.
Sorry, I was having a problem unmuting myself.
Get it.
A couple of things I just wanted to circle back on. The fact that Miriam was referred to as Aaron's sister. So Steinsaltz says that was a custom in those days, that both men and women sometimes were referred not by their father, but by the oldest brother if the father had died. So that may just be normal, but the Reform version of the Torah says that Moses was out, you know, he was in the palace, and Miriam had a relationship with Aaron, because they were the children that were left. So she grew up with him where Moses was somewhere else. So maybe that's why she was referred as his sister, because the relationship was stronger.
Yeah.
Those are two common things, but my comment on the song and the song, why can't that first line be the refrain and the chorus for the song? Like, in a lot of times we do the same thing. The first couple of lines are repeated multiple times. And the other thing is that there are a lot of places in the Torah where they just stop. There's just like they leave you with this nothing. There's just a sentence, and then they don't go anywhere. So I don't know whether it's the scribe couldn't figure out what to say next, or whether it's just that you have to assume that the women in those days were the ones that danced. The men didn't anyway. They just stood around watching.
I have to tell you, like,
which is another sexist thing, but
yeah, this is like, you know, speaking of gender distinctions, right? Like, I've spent a lot of time in gender divided prayer spaces, and sometimes, like, you'll see, you know, the dancing separated, men dancing and women dancing, and in this case, at least anecdotally, SJ is exactly right, which is that, like, being on the men's side, you're sort of like, you know, Jews don't really dance. You're like slumping around and like moving in your awkward circle. And then you look over at the women's side and they've like choreographed like Israeli dance, and they're coming in and out and everything's beautifully played. So there is, like, when genders are divided, sometimes there actually develops very different approaches to dance and song. And as SJ says, my experience also bears out the fact that women maybe are better at that, at least in gender divided situations. All right, let's continue to consider Randy and then Jen.
So, you know, this part in the Torah always reminds me of like opera. I mean, all of Torah reminds me of opera, but especially here, because like you have opera chorus, the first part, Moshe, and then you have opera ballet. So first of all, I wanted to just suggest that the instruments and the dancing, the first time is certainly a cappella. At least that's what we think. There are no instruments. The second time there are instruments and there seems to be dancing. But I was going to suggest two other things, and stop me if I get like too technical. I'm a musician, so I think this way. But it seems to me that it would make sense that the men and the women wouldn't be singing together, because if this is, somebody has suggested this is a chant. So the point of chant typically is that there's one line and it's a melody and it's not harmonized. And harmony often distracts from the words if we have words. So if you don't have harmony, if you just have a single melody, you want just the men singing alone, the women singing alone. If you mix the voices, you would maybe tend to have harmony, or harmony would more likely happen. So that's what I was thinking, is that, and I'm happy to take it literally. The men sang first, no harmony, just chanting. Then the women sang, and maybe they just sang those few lines, or they sang the words of those few lines. They continued to chant, they continued to play the instruments, and they continued to dance as long as they wanted to. So in other words, the piece could have gone on for a very long time, but you only heard the words of the first couple of lines.
Great.
I guess that's
great.
Sort of the operatic way I was conceiving this.
This, I think, is another, I think the last two comments are two more votes for the idea of Miriam as the kind of conductor. Miriam as the one who actually turns it into a musical phenomenon. Like Moses leads the people in this song, but it in some ways is very flat. There's no harmony. It's just a chant. And then Miriam comes in and includes dance and instruments, and they're all marching out, and the vocal alternation between the deeper men's voice and then the women's voice, and then back and forth. And all of a sudden you have an orchestra.
Well, you don't need, you've heard the words, you've heard the text once.
Right.
So the second time around, it's not so important that you hear every word. So the second time around, you get, things that are going to help you remember the words. We remember things often by putting music to them, right? Mm-hmm. So if you add a beat, if you add choreography, like there's like muscle memory or something like that, you get the words. And somehow, clearly these words were very important, because the whole narrative stops. And it's not just Moshe speaking, it's everybody singing, and we get the words to the whole song. So I think that, this is like, what's the word I'm looking for? When you do it more than once, and so you're, anyway, it reinforces just what the words were saying. I think it's beautiful. I think it's very dramatic, and I think it's incredibly operatic. And it makes me think that opera actually learned from Torah. So.
Oh, I like that. I used to study in a kind of an ultra-Orthodox yeshiva, and one of the messages that the Rosh Yeshiva would tell us often is, if you see something good in the world, then you know it comes from Torah.
Well,
it's like somehow you can trace it back.
Mozart, Puccini, Wagner, all of them, yes.
Jen.
I'm going to be a little salty, just because I feel like gender is such a shiny object that it's very tempting to reach out and grab. But there's nothing in this text that suggests that the women thought that line was more important or cared more about it, because Miriam's the one leading them singing. Miriam, it might have been more important to Miriam, but that doesn't say anything about what the rest of the women felt or thought.
Mhm.
And the commentators and us and me too will read this sometimes and go, oh, well, the men are doing one thing and the women are doing something else. So clearly this is about gender and
Yeah.
not about Moses and Miriam, or the Torah saying that that first line is actually more important than the rest of the song. We don't go into that analytical place because we get so distracted by gender and what it says about women. And I think it's worth interrogating why we do that and then trying to take that out of the conversation at some point and look at it without taking the gendered lens and see what we're missing.
Okay, excellent. And I'm particularly excited by what Jen is suggesting, that this wasn't a women-men thing. This was like Miriam was having a moment and Miriam was saying, so what's really great about that that interpretation is that it has a very strong root in the text itself, because the text says I hate this. Vata'an and Miriam singular, lahem. That pronoun is not just to women. That's a pronoun that includes all of them, men and women. So Miriam answered to them. Who's them? Moses and the children of Israel, right? So this is Jen says, and has some real support in the text, this isn't a women's moment. This is a Miriam moment. Now, I want us to keep in mind, I mean, Moses and Miriam themselves as a kind of prophetic duo inevitably suggest sort of like gender roles perhaps, but Jen warns us, let's not get too carried away with it. Let's not necessarily imagine that the entire nation split up into like the women's side and the men's side. Okay, well said. I want to introduce one last commentary, and I'll come back to the folks who still have their hands up, but I want to introduce one last commentary. Remember, we've considered Rashi, who said Miriam and the women said the same thing that Moses and the men did. And we've looked at a commentary that assumed, no, Miriam and the women just said that first line. And we have done, I think, a beautiful job of imagining how that actually means something very different. Could mean that she turned it into a real song with orchestration, etc. Here is yet another interpretation that imagines that Miriam and the women did something else. And all of this notwithstanding Jen's last comment that maybe it isn't Miriam and the women, but this last interpretation of the Netziv, Ha'emek Davar, it's the most recent. It was in the 19th century. And what he says here is sort of interesting. He, like Wendy, focuses on, the fact that it doesn't say that she said or sang, but that she responded or answered. And here's what he says. Aniyah, answering, always means either that someone hears something said from someone else and then says it after them. So like chants and responds. Or that someone hears one thing and then responds with something else related to the first thing. It's like a particular, what does it mean to answer? It means you have an answer to it. You respond to it, okay? And so he imagines, oh, there must have been some kind of response here. Like Miriam started to pick up on the song, but then said something different. So he says, what happened, if that is so, he says, then we have to understand why it uses the language of she answered here when it should have been she said or sang. What happened then, he says, is that the women composed a long song, which wasn't recorded in the Torah because it didn't come from the flow of the spirit of prophecy. Ruach HaKodesh is the phrase here. It's a phrase that's been ruined for us by Christians because it means the Holy Spirit, which in our lexicon is the spirit of prophecy, but I usually don't translate it as a Holy Spirit because it sounds like something else. But his point is, Moses, like everything Moses said, it was just channeling God's song. Moses just like, everything Moses says goes into the Torah. Miriam started a response, and it doesn't go into the Torah because it's not the prophecy of Moses. That's what the Torah is. But he imagines that what Miriam and the women did was they sang another song. You've got a song, we'll compose a song. And a different song emerged. Like Miriam's job was to encourage the people to come up with new songs. You got that song? I've got, now I have to say, this answer I think fits least well into the verses. Like, I'm not sure exactly, because he still have to explain why she begins with the first line, but it's just interesting to me that what he imagines is, this actually was a moment where the shorthand is not that Miriam repeated the song, but the shorthand is, yeah, Miriam started singing and they just came up with all kinds of new songs, right? So that also is a very different kind of read of the scene there after having crossed the sea. So I throw that out. Now we've got, did Miriam sing the same song? Did Miriam take the song and extract a line and then create a song? Or did Miriam lead people or just herself sing an entirely new song, right? I mean, we know, after all, that singing a new song is considered one of the great kind of spiritual acts in our tradition, right? So maybe this is a moment where Miriam sang a new song. All right, we'll wrap up soon, but let me see if folks, any last lingering interpretations out there. I see Matt.
Yes, there's another thing going on here. In the plagues, there's a tension between whether Moses is doing stuff or Aaron is doing stuff. And there's a tension between those two. And maybe what matters here is that simply that it is Miriam and not Aaron. That it is a different, that's the thing going back and forth, not between men and women, but between who is the other one besides Moses. And it's Miriam, not that Aaron guy who's trying to take all the credit.
Excellent, excellent, excellent reading. Very, very well said. And it fits so nice. Like, now you have a sense of why she's Aaron's sister. Yeah, Aaron's sister, but Miriam was the other leader. Now, whether that has to do with her leading the women or not, Matt doesn't require that. Matt sees this as a moment where it's not about the women also, it's about Miriam also. Miriam was the other great leader of Israel, and she also led the people in song or sang a song. And this, in some ways, the most important thing about it is that it's Miriam's moment. And what works about Matt's interpretation is that that's why we hear Miriam was also a prophet. And like, even more clever, Matt's interpretation, Miriam was Aaron's sister, but it wasn't Aaron who was the big deal. It was Miriam who was the big deal. That's really interesting. On that note, I'd like to just close then with one scene that I think is it's not a shot. It's not a reading of the verses per se, but it is a very beautiful description of the scene here. And it's a much earlier commentary. This is, I found this in another article by Rabbi Chaim Ovadia, and he quotes very little known midrash that was written in the Gaonic period, which is the period between the rabbis of the Talmud and the medieval period. We're talking like 800, 900. And he finds this, I would never have found this on my own, but he finds this beautiful description here that I'd like to end on, which is that Hitchila Miriam v'nashim b'shira, Miriam and the women started to sing. In other words, Moses led a song, but then there was a moment, I don't know, like silence, like nobody knew what to do with it. And then Miriam and the women started to sing, and then all of Israel began to sing, and then the angels joined in, right? Such a beautiful, Miriam somehow summoned all of Israel and the angels. But I think it's just a beautiful image, but I think actually it does echo what seems to be one of the strongest interpretations that emerged in our group's discussion, which I feel really compelled by, which is that what Miriam did was to take something that Moses, who's, a prophet and zoned in and knows all the words and chants them almost like just automatically as a kind of channel for God. But Miriam hears that and says, you know what? Let's turn this into music, right? Like, I'm going to take that first line, okay, ladies, now let's get in formation, right? Like, all the ladies come out and like, let's do a thing here. And she's the one that turns song into music. And that's a powerful, actually, moment to record in the Torah. So, okay, lots of options here. I appreciate all of your comments, interpretations. Sorry to the folks I didn't get to. And everybody have a beautiful Shabbat Shira, Sabbath of Song. Okay, I'll see you next week.